The wind howled like a wounded animal across the Montana Valley that December night. Harold Mercer stood at his cabin window, watching the snow fall in thick, violent sheets that erased the world beyond his porch. At 73 years old, he had seen his share of storms, but none quite like this one. The radio had warned a historic blizzard, the kind that buried houses and claimed lives without apology. His old German shepherd, Baron, lay near the wood stove, his gray muzzle resting on his paws. At 12 years old, Baron moved slower now. His hips ached in the cold, and his dark eyes carried the quiet wisdom of a dog who had seen too much and loved too deeply. He had been Harold's shadow for over a decade, through the death of Harold's wife, through the silence that followed, through every sunrise that felt like a punishment and every sunset that felt like mercy. But tonight, something was different. Baron lifted his head suddenly, ears perked, nostrils flaring. A low whine escaped his throat, a sound Harold had not heard in years. It was the sound Baron made when something was wrong, when something needed saving. "Easy, boy," Harold murmured, turning from a window. "It's just a storm." But Baron was already on his feet, limping toward the door with an urgency that defied his age. He scratched at the wood, barked once, sharp and desperate, then looked back at Harold with eyes that begged him to understand. Harold felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. He grabbed his coat, his flashlight, and his father's old rifle. He didn't know why. He didn't ask questions. After all these years, he had learned to trust Baron's instincts more than his own. When he opened the door, the wind nearly knocked him backward. Baron pushed past him and disappeared into the white void, his dark shape swallowed by the blizzard within seconds. "Baron!" Harold shouted, but his voice was stolen by the wind. He had no choice. He followed. What they found in the abandoned barn at the edge of his property would change everything. Not just for Harold, not just for Baron, but for a stranger whose life hung by a thread in the frozen darkness. Some say angels were white, but that night, Harold Mercer learned that sometimes angels have 4 legs, gray fur, and a heart bigger than any storm. Before we begin this incredible journey, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. It helps us bring you more true and emotional stories from the heart. And if this story moves you, share it with someone who believes loyalty still matters. Harold Mercer had not always been a man of silence. There was a time, decades ago, when laughter echoed through these walls, when the scent of Margaret's apple pie filled every corner, when the future seemed like a promise instead of a threat. But that was before the cancer took her, before the quiet moved in like an unwanted guest and never left. Now, at 73, Harold lived alone in the cabin he had built with his own hands 40 years ago. The walls were sturdy. The roof held strong, but the emptiness inside was something no hammer or nail could fix. His 3 children had scattered across the country, one in California, one in New York, one in Texas. They called on holidays. Sometimes they sent cards with photographs of grandchildren he barely recognized. They meant well, but meaning well and being present are 2 very different things. Baron was all he had left. The German shepherd had arrived 12 years ago, a gift from Margaret during her final autumn. She had seen the puppy at a rescue event in town, malnourished, shivering, with eyes that held a sadness no creature so young should carry. She had brought him home without asking Harold's permission, placed a trembling bundle in his arms, and said, "He needs you, and whether you admit it or not, you need him too." She died 3 weeks later. Harold had wanted to hate the dog. He had wanted to resent the responsibility, the daily reminder of what he had lost. But Baron had a way of breaking through walls. He slept at the foot of Harold's bed, followed him to the woodpile, sat beside him during the long evenings when the grief felt like drowning. He never demanded anything. He simply stayed. And staying, Harold learned, was its own kind of love. Now Baron was old. His black and tan coat had faded to silver in places. His hind legs trembled when he walked, and some mornings he needed help standing. The veterinarian in town, Dr. Cassidy, a kind woman with gentle hands, had told Harold 6 months ago that Baron's heart was weakening. "He's got time," she said, "but not as much as we'd like. Make it count." Harold had nodded, unable to speak. He had driven home that day with Baron's head resting on his lap, and cried for the first time since Margaret's funeral. Tonight, as the blizzard raged outside, Harold sat in his worn leather chair and watched Barron sleep by the fire. The old dog's chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, his paws twitching as he dreamed of younger days. Chasing rabbits, running through meadows, being whole and unbroken. Harold envied him those dreams. The storm had started around noon, a wall of white descending from the mountains with terrifying speed. Harold had spent the afternoon securing the shutters, stacking firewood inside, filling every pot and bucket with water in case the pipes froze. He had done this alone, Barron watching from his bed, too stiff to help, but present nonetheless. Always present. By nightfall, the world outside had become a howling void. The temperature had dropped to 15 below zero, and the wind gusted past 40 miles per hour. Harold had tuned the radio to the emergency broadcast station, listening to the grim reports. Roads closed, power lines down, travelers stranded. They warned residents to stay indoors, to wait for rescue, to pray. Harold had stopped praying years ago, but he kept the radio on anyway, just for the company of another voice. It was around 8 o'clock when Barron woke suddenly. Harold had been dozing in his chair, the fire crackling low, when the sound of the dog's whine cut through the quiet. He opened his eyes to see Barron standing, actually standing, with his ears pointed toward the door and his body rigid with tension. "What is it, boy?" Harold asked, sitting up. Barron didn't look at him. His focus was absolute, his instincts firing like they hadn't in years. He walked toward the front door with a purpose that seemed impossible for a dog his age, his nails clicking against the wooden floor. Harold stood, his knees protesting, and followed. "There's nothing out there but snow and death," he said. "Come on, come back to the fire." But Barron scratched at the door, barked once, and looked back at Harold with an expression that stopped the old man's heart. It was a look Margaret used to give him when she knew something he didn't, when she was certain, when there was no arguing. Harold grabbed his coat. The cold hit Harold like a physical blow the moment he stepped outside. It stole his breath, burned his lungs, and turned the moisture in his eyes to ice within seconds. He pulled his scarf tighter, gripped his flashlight, and squinted into the wall of white that had consumed his property. Barron was already 10 feet ahead, a dark shape against the snow, moving with determination that defied his age and his ailments. Harold called out to him, but the wind swallowed his voice. He had no choice but to follow. The snow came up past his boots within seconds. Each step was a battle, his legs sinking, his balance faltering. Harold was not a weak man. Decades of farm work and cabin life had kept him strong, but he was old, and the storm seemed to know it. It pushed against him, mocked him, dared him to turn back. He didn't turn back. Barron led him past the woodshed, past the frozen vegetable garden, past the old well that hadn't worked in 20 years. Harold recognized the path even through the blizzard. It led to the abandoned barn at the far edge of his property, a structure he hadn't entered in over a decade. It had belonged to the previous owners, farmers who had died before Harold was born. The roof had partially collapsed years ago, and the whole thing leaned slightly to the east, like a tired man ready to surrender. Why was Barron going there? The journey that should have taken 5 minutes took nearly 20. Harold stumbled twice, catching himself on fence posts he could barely see. His hands had gone numb inside his gloves, and he could no longer feel his face. The flashlight beam was almost useless against the density of the falling snow, but he kept it aimed at Barron's retreating form, terrified of losing sight of him. And then, through the chaos, he saw it, the dark shape of the barn emerging from the white like a ghost ship on a frozen sea. One of its massive doors had blown open, hanging by a single hinge, banging rhythmically against the frame. Barron disappeared through the opening, without hesitation. Harold reached the doorway and paused, gasping for breath. His chest ached, his vision swam, and for a moment he wondered if he would die here, steps away from whatever his dog had led him to find. But then Barron's bark echoed from inside, sharp, urgent, alive, and Harold forced himself forward. The interior of the barn was marginally warmer, shielded from the direct assault of the wind. Harold's flashlight swept across rotting hay bales, rusted tools, collapsed beams, and decades of neglect. The smell was thick, mold, animal musk, and something else, something metallic, blood. Barron stood in the far corner, beside what Harold initially thought was a pile of old blankets. But then the pile moved. A groan escaped from it. Human, weak, desperate. Harold's heart stopped. He rushed forward, his numb legs threatening to give out, and dropped his knees beside the figure. The flashlight revealed a young woman, perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair matted to her forehead and skin so pale it seemed translucent. She wore a thin jacket entirely unsuited for weather, and her lips had turned a terrifying shade of blue. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, and she whispered something Harold couldn't understand. But then his flashlight moved lower, and he understood why Barron had brought him here. The woman was holding something against her chest. Something small, wrapped in her own scarf, barely moving. A baby. Harold's hands shook as he leaned closer. The infant couldn't have been more than a few months old, its tiny face red and pinched from the cold. It was alive. He could see the faint rise and fall of its chest, but barely. The woman had clearly used her own body to shield the child from the cold, sacrificing herself to keep her baby warm. "Please," she breathed, her eyes finding Harold's face. "Please, save her." Barron pressed his warm body against the woman's side, offering what heat he could. He looked at Harold with those ancient, knowing eyes that seemed to say, "This is why I brought you here. This is why we came." Harold didn't hesitate. He stripped off his coat and wrapped it around the woman and child together. He lifted them both, an act that should have been impossible for a man his age, and turned toward the door. "Hold on," he said. "Both of you. Hold on." The storm still raged outside, but Harold Mercer was no longer afraid of it. By morning, the storm had weakened to a steady snowfall. The wind had died, and the world outside Harold's window lay buried under 3 feet of white. The road to town would be impassable for days, maybe longer. They were alone out here, Harold, Barron, Elena, and the baby, isolated, hidden. Harold had slept in snatches, waking every hour to check on Elena and feed the fire. She was recovering slowly. Her color had returned, and she could sit up now without dizziness. Hope had nursed during the night, her cries growing stronger, more demanding, life asserting itself despite everything. Barron had not moved from his spot by the couch. He lay with his head near Elena's hand, as if guarding her even in his exhaustion. His breathing was still labored, and Harold noticed he hadn't eaten since before the storm. That worried him more than he wanted to admit. Over breakfast, canned soup and crackers, the best Harold could manage under the circumstances, Elena began to talk. Her voice was hesitant at first, broken by long pauses, but Harold didn't rush her. He had learned long ago that some stories could only be told at their own pace. Elena was from Nevada. She had married young, too young, she said, to a man who seemed charming until the doors closed and the masks came off. His name was Marcus. He worked in construction, made good money, and had a temper that could turn a good day into a nightmare with no warning. For 3 years, Elena had endured it. She had told herself it would get better. She had believed his apologies, his promises, his tears. Then she got pregnant. When Hope was born, Elena said, staring into her soup, I saw the way he looked at her, like she was property, like she was something he owned. Her voice cracked. I knew then I had to leave. Not for me, for her. She had planned her escape for months. Saved cash in small amounts. Memorized bus routes. Packed a bag and hidden it in the basement. Then, one night, while Marcus was passed out drunk, she had taken Hope and run. She had made it across 2 states before her car broke down on the highway during the storm. She had walked for miles, carrying Hope, searching for shelter. The barn had seemed like salvation, a place to wait out the worst of it. She hadn't known how cold it would get. She hadn't known how close she had come to dying. I prayed, she said, looking at Harold with eyes that glistened. I haven't prayed since I was a little girl. But last night I prayed, and then your dog appeared out of the snow like an angel. And then you. Harold was silent for a long moment. He thought about Margaret, about the way she had brought Barron home with the same certainty that had driven the dog into the storm last night. He thought about all the years of loneliness, the silence, the feeling that his purpose had died along with his wife. Maybe it hadn't. Maybe it had just been waiting. "You can stay here as long as you need," he said finally. "When the road's clear, we'll figure out a plan. There are people who can help, shelters, lawyers, folks who deal with situations like yours. You don't have to go back to him. You don't have to go back to any of it." Elena's tears fell freely now. "Why are you helping me? You don't even know me." Harold looked at Barron, who had lifted his head to watch them. The old dog's tail wagged weakly, just once, as if in answer. "Because someone helped me once," Harold said, "when I didn't deserve it, when I was too broken to ask for it. She brought me that dog over there, and she told me he needed me. But the truth was, I needed him." He paused, his throat tight. "I think maybe this is how I pay that back. By being here when someone else needs it." Elena reached out and took his hand. Her grip was weak, but it held. "Thank you," she whispered. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and silent now, covering the tracks of the night before. Whatever darkness Elena had fled, whatever demons were searching for her, they would not find her here. Not today. Harold squeezed her hand gently and released it. "Rest now," he said. "We've got time." But even as he spoke, he knew the peace wouldn't last forever. Marcus was out there somewhere, and men like Marcus didn't let go easily. 5 days passed in a strange, fragile peace. The snow melted enough for Harold to dig a path to his truck, though the main road remained blocked by drifts taller than a man. He drove to the edge of his property each morning, checking for signs of plows, for any indication that the outside world was returning. Elena grew stronger. She helped with meals, cleaned when Harold wasn't looking, and spent hours holding Hope by the fire while Barron lay at her feet. The old dog had taken to her completely, following her from room to room, resting his head in her lap, watching over the baby with a devotion that surprised even Harold. But Barron was fading. Harold could see it in the way he struggled to rise each morning, in the way his eyes seemed to look through things instead of at them. Dr. Cassidy's words echoed in his mind. "He's got time, but not as much as we'd like." Time was running out. Harold knew it, and he suspected Barron knew it too. On the 6th morning, the peace shattered. Harold was outside splitting wood when he heard the sound. An engine, distant but growing closer. He set down his axe and watched the road. Minutes later, a black pickup truck appeared to the tree line, moving slowly through the snowdrifts, chains on its tires. It wasn't a plow. It wasn't the sheriff. And Harold knew, with cold certainty, who it was. He walked inside, closing the door quietly behind him. Elena was in the kitchen, washing dishes. She looked up at his expression and froze. "Someone's coming," Harold said. "Black pickup. You know anyone who drives a truck like that?" The color drained from Elena's face. Her hands trembled so violently she dropped the glass she was holding, and it shattered on the floor. "Marcus," she breathed. "He found me. Oh, God, he found me." Hope began to cry in her basket by the fire. Barron lifted his head, ears forward, body tense. Harold moved quickly. "Take Hope into the back bedroom. Close the door, and don't come out until I tell you. There's a window in there. If things go bad, you take her and run into the trees. You understand?" Elena was shaking, tears streaming down her face, but she nodded. She scooped up Hope and disappeared down the hallway. The bedroom door clicked shut. Harold went to the cabinet above his bed and retrieved his father's rifle. He checked the chamber, loaded, and walked the front door just as a truck pulled into his yard. The man who stepped out was younger than Harold expected, maybe 35, with broad shoulders, a shaved head, and the cold eyes of someone who had long ago stopped seeing other people as human. He wore a heavy jacket and work boots, and his hands hung at his sides like weapons waiting to be used. "Morning," the man called out, his voice carrying across the snow. "I'm looking for my wife. Pretty girl, dark hair, has a baby with her. Someone in town said they saw a woman matching that description walking this direction during the storm." Harold stepped onto the porch, rifle held casually but visibly. "No one here but me and my dog." Marcus smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Mind if I take a look around? Just to be sure." "Yes," Harold said. "I do mind." The smile faded. Marcus took a step forward, his posture shifting into something predatory. "Old man, I don't want trouble, but that's my wife and my kid in there. I've got a right to them." "No one has a right to another person," Harold said quietly. "Especially not someone who uses her fists to make a point." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "She told you lies. She's crazy. Ask anyone. I've seen the bruises. I've heard the story. And I'm telling you now, you need to leave. This is your only warning." For a long moment, neither man moved. The wind whispered through the trees. Barron appeared at Harold's side, having pushed through the door, old, limping, but standing, his lips pulled back from his teeth, and a growl rumbled from deep in his chest. Marcus looked at the dog, then at the rifle, then back at Harold's face. Something flickered in his expression. Not fear, but calculation. He was weighing his options. "This isn't over," he said finally. "I'll be back. And next time, I won't be asking permission." He climbed back into his truck, backed out of the yard, and disappeared down the road. Harold stood on the porch until the sound of the engine faded completely. Then he knelt beside Barron, wrapped his arms around the old dog's neck, and held him. "Good boy," he whispered. "You brave, beautiful boy." The storm was over, but the real battle had just begun. Marcus returned that night. Harold had expected it. He had spent the afternoon preparing, barricading windows, moving furniture, teaching Elena how to use a rifle if it came to that. He called the sheriff's office, but the roads were still impassable in most places. Help was at least a day away, maybe more. They were on their own. The sound of breaking glass woke Harold at 3 a.m. He was on his feet before his mind fully registered what was happening, the rifle in his hands, his heart pounding against his ribs. Barron was already at the bedroom door, barking furiously. "Stay with the baby," Harold shouted to Elena. "No matter what you hear, stay with her." He moved through the dark cabin, his eyes adjusting, his ears straining for sound. The kitchen window had been shattered, cold air pouring through, and in the shadows, a figure moved. Marcus. He was faster than Harold anticipated. He tackled the old man before Harold could raise the rifle, sending them both crashing into the dining table. Harold felt something crack, a rib maybe, and pain exploded through his chest. The rifle skittered across the floor, out of reach. Marcus pinned him down, one hand at Harold's throat, the other raised in a fist. "You should have minded your own business, old man," he snarled. "Now you're going to die, and I'm going to take back what's mine." Harold couldn't breathe. His vision was dimming, his hands clawing uselessly at the arm that crushed his windpipe. This is it, he thought. This is how it ends. But then came a sound, a roar, primal and furious, that seemed to shake the walls. Barron launched himself through the darkness with a strength that should have been impossible for a dog his age. His jaws clamped onto Marcus's arm, teeth sinking deep, and the man screamed. Marcus released Harold and staggered backward, trying to shake off the dog. But Barron held on, his old body trembling with the effort, his eyes wild with fire that had been dormant for years. He was no longer a tired, dying dog. He was protector, a warrior, a force of nature. Harold grabbed the rifle and rose to his feet. "Get off my property," he said, his voice steady despite the pain. "Now, or I swear on my wife's grave, I will end you." Marcus finally wrenched free from Barron's grip, blood streaming down his arm. He looked at the rifle, then at the dog who stood between him in the hallway, and finally at Harold's eyes. He saw no hesitation there, no mercy. Without another word, Marcus ran. Harold followed him to the door and watched him stumble through the snow toward his truck. The engine roared to life, and the black pickup disappeared into the night. Only then did Harold allow himself to collapse. He fell to his knees beside Barron, who had crumpled onto the floor, his breathing shallow and rapid. The effort had cost him everything. Harold could see it, the light fading from those ancient, loyal eyes. "No," Harold whispered, pulling the dog into his arms. "No, not yet. Please, not yet." Barron's tail wagged once, weakly. He licked Harold's hand, a gesture he had made 1,000 times before, but never with such finality. His eyes found Harold's face, and in them Harold saw not pain, but peace. I did what I came here to do. Those eyes seemed to say, I protected you. I protected them. I can rest now. Elena emerged from the bedroom, Hope in her arms, tears streaming down her face. She knelt beside Harold, one hand on his shoulder, the other reaching out to touch Baron's silver fur. He saved us, she said through her tears. He saved all of us. Harold couldn't speak. He held Baron as the old dog's breathing slowed, as the fire crackled and the night grew quiet, as the last great storm of Baron's life finally passed. When dawn came, Harold buried his friend beneath the oak tree where Margaret rested. Elena stood beside him, holding Hope, while the first light of the new day painted the snow in gold. Thank you, Harold whispered to the grave, for everything. In the years that followed, Elena never left. She and Hope became the family Harold thought he had lost forever, and though another German shepherd eventually came to live in the cabin, a rescue, of course, as Baron would have wanted, Harold never forgot the dog who had walked into a storm and changed everything. Some say loyalty dies with the body, but Harold knew the truth. Real loyalty is eternal. It doesn't end. It just transforms. In a world that often forgets its elders and abandons its old dogs, Harold Mercer and Baron remind us of something eternal. That love, true love, is not measured by time or strength, but by the willingness to stand beside someone when the storm comes. Baron gave everything, not because he was asked to, but because that's what love does. It shows up, it fights, it stays, even when staying costs everything. And Harold, a man who thought his purpose had ended, discovered that purpose never truly dies. It waits. It finds us when we need it most. It asks us to be brave enough to follow an old dog into the snow and trust that the journey matters. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Share it with someone who believes loyalty still matters, and who knows that sometimes the greatest heroes have 4 legs and a heart that never gives up. Thank you for being here. Until next time,